Hello. After our last discussion, we will be beginning to talk about the Archaic Age and the development of the polis. After the decline of the Mycenaean civilization, Greece entered a dark period, the Dark Ages. Not to say that there wasn't any development or cultural contributions during this about 300-year period. There were, and we'll discuss those when we talk about major Greek contributions. However, there wasn't a lot of organization. Many of the areas and many of the trade destinations were destroyed, not to be rebuilt for some time. And it is not until the Archaic Age, about 300 years after the decline of the Mycenaean civilization, that we really start to develop what it means to be Greek. Greece gets its identity in the Archaic Age. Even though it's still individual city-states, even though, like the Mycenaeans, they were still competing for resources for trade, we start to see that development of what it means to be Greek. There are three major themes that I want you to keep in mind when we look at this Archaic Age presentation. First off, the significance of the Homeric epics as not just literature, but a window into the time period. Of course, Homer is writing about the Trojan War, which supposedly took place during the Mycenaean civilization. However, these Homeric epics were distributed amongst pretty much all the people of Greece. They began as folk tales, handed down, oral storytelling, and later compiled and written down and credited to Homer. How the common bonds, and there are four of them, of Greece act as a binding force against the natural development of the city-states due to geography. So what set aside people to think of themselves from time to time as an Athenian or a Corinthian or a Dorian or a Spartan and say, today I'm a Greek? Also, the interconnectedness of the development of the Athenian polis and the structure of classes and the family. So what did Athenian society look like? What did the Athenian polis, the city-state with the central marketplace, center of government, society, and religion, surrounding farmland and ports, what did it look like? What did it mean to be an Athenian during the Dark Age? Remember, much of our early knowledge comes from Homer, especially into the Mycenaean civilization. Chances are, if it wasn't dug up as part of archaeology, it's the Iliad or the Odyssey that we're reading. It's not until much, much later on that we see other works being produced that are mass-produced, that we can still see across Greece, like Hesiod or Sappho. Of course, takes place about the war upon the city of Troy, believed to be in modern-day Turkey, Anatolia. Let's talk about these common bonds. First off, there is a common Greek language. Now, there were some earlier languages with the Mycenaeans just sort of coined as Linear A and Linear B, but we do start to see in the Archaic Age a common language develop and literature. Now, this literature, of course, is the Homeric epics, or are the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Second common bond is religion. Now, this can be a uniter, but also a divider. What you have is a large pantheon of gods. You have Zeus as the king of the gods, the thunder god. Apollo is the sun god. Athena is the wise goddess, the goddess of philosophy and love. All of them live in northeast Greece at Mount Olympus. A large pantheon of gods and myths with individual patron gods for city-states. We've seen patron gods before. There were a lot of gods running around, a lot of myths running around with Greece. Chances are, if there was a story to be told, it had the involvement of gods, their interaction, like we saw with the Homeric epics. A great example of this interaction of gods with human affairs is Prometheus. It's not just a movie title anymore. Prometheus stole fire from the gods, gave it to man, was punished, was laid out on a rock. His liver was eaten by vultures every day, only to grow back again. He later recants to Zeus, and he is accepted into the fold, and sort of humans are given this object of fire, and sort of, what do we do with it? How do we deal with it? Fire causes a lot of great things for humanity, but it also destroys cities. It's that common theme that we'll see later on in Greek drama of the Greek tragedy, that many of these stories ended in tragedy. The third uniting force are outside enemies. most notably the Persian Empire. Greeks would fight amongst themselves until there was a larger threat from the outside. It's sort of like a high school. Seniors don't get along with freshmen. However, when you're on the same team and you're facing somebody else, you cooperate. You don't necessarily love that person, but you still have enough cooperation amongst themselves. So during two different Persian wars, Greeks are going to come together and really have that common bond. Now, the last common bond, and it's very common, are the public games, what eventually become the Olympics. These Olympics were very important. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that city-states had professional teams to represent them in the Olympics. They were not just, oh, every 4 years we'll get together and have a friendly competition. No, it was high stakes. Oftentimes, and city-states that were warring with each other would strike treaties for 4 months in advance of an upcoming Olympics so that their soldiers could go home and train for games, whether it be wrestling, racing, you name it. And even though it was competition between individual city-states and there were rivals in these Olympics, it was still better than going out to the fields and killing each other, and it was still there in place to decide who was the best Greek. Not that necessarily Athenians were better than Corinthians, but who were the best of the Greeks. That national identity that really lacked because, well, Greece wasn't a nation. During the Archaic Age, we have a lot of government development. Now, we're going to focus a lot more on government development when we talk about our tyrannical reformers. However, there are some things in the Archaic Age that we need to be aware of. First off, ancient Greece was, for the most part, a patriarchal society. And what we mean by patriarchal, when you see that word, is that it's a male or father-dominated society. Most women were denied rights. You were not allowed as a woman to leave your house unless you had a male escort. That male escort either being A, your father, or B, your husband, which you typically didn't get to choose who was going to be your husband. Most of the city-states followed a similar pattern of development. They followed Athens. Athens becomes this great city-state, and many of them are going to follow what is known as the Athenian model to democracy. Now, very simple, nothing too complex here. We need to understand what this Athenian model is before we start to talk about specific individual historical figures. First off, dating back to the Mycenaeans even, starts off as a monarchy. One ruler, one military king. However, over time, what we see develop is an aristocracy around that monarchy, the nobility. It is a small group of rich nobles, and, like I've said before, the proof is not in the pudding. The profit is in the land. After the aristocrats take over, tyranny develops. Typically when we refer to tyranny, it's a bad thing. We don't want tyrannical people. But what we have here are not tyrannical dictators. What we have are a long chain, give or take, some of them aren't that good, but a long chain of tyrannical reformers, where we have a rule by one man from the military generally, and they usually stick up for those who are oppressed, usually the poor farmers, by the aristocracy. The reason that they do this is that they are not nobles. They do not come from the upper crest of society all the time. They stick up for where they came from, even though they have prospered as a result of their military careers. After all of these reforms take place, what we start to see develop are democratic principles, rule by the people. Whether it's a large democratic body, whether it's a small village voting on decisions, or whether it's later on, we see it prominent in the Roman Republic is a representative democracy, where people are there put in place to represent different tribes. We also see that with later on Cleisthenes' Council of 500, which we see in Athens. In Archaic Age Greece, it's very important to note the development of the Acropolis. it helps bring about really a flourishing of Greek ideals. Remember, they're at the center of trade routes. They need a place to share these ideas. All these different poli are independently developing, and outside of the Acropolis, which I'm going to show you on the next slide, there is an agora. Now, the agora refers to as a central marketplace. Remember, when we exchange goods, we also exchange ideas. So, here we have the Acropolis. The Acropolis was typically built on a hill. There you see the Athens Parthenon in the upper left. It's built on a hill to be better defendable. This, coupled with the surrounding agora in the lower left-hand side, the central marketplace, it was a center of government, society, and religion. It was a place to meet, greet, share ideas, get legislation passed, get new ideas out there. The basic social structure of Archaic Age Greece were citizens, the smallest segment of society. In a city of 200,000 people, citizens would make up about 40,000 of the population. Women and foreigners had no political rights. They made up a large portion of the population, but the biggest population in a typical city-state were slaves. Now, this was not racially based. They were typically either prisoners of war or debt slaves. Now, a debt slave was somebody that owed a debt, would work for a period of time until that debt was paid off, according to whoever owned that person. Slavery was also not hereditary. If you were a child of two slaves, that did not mean that you were a slave. You were born free in the typical Athenian model. Now, as we talked about in the first presentation, Greece is a very mountainous terrain. It does not have a lot of suitable farmland. As they begin to prosper through trade, geographic factors are going to lead to overcrowding. They start establishing colonies throughout the Mediterranean basin. They're going to go to the Italian peninsula, which is going to later influence the Roman Empire. They're going to go to North Africa. They're going to go pretty much all throughout that region of the world. Now, we start moving away from the barter system where we're trading one good for another good or surface, and we start to see coined money. We start to see our gold Greek coins pop up as well, which is very important. To live in Greece during this time, especially one of the major trade destinations, it was a cosmopolitan area. There were a lot of groups in one certain part of the world. Now, the typical family were the husband, wife, and kids, and slaves. Sometimes extended family were included. It depended on the situation. Typically in the lower classes, your typical workers, your merchants, you saw more of the extended family in one household. Women, you cannot own property. Like we said before, male guardian required for leaving the house, for travel, for anything. So, this is what you should have gotten out of this Archaic Age presentation. The significance of the Homeric epics is not just literature, but a window into the time period. It wasn't dug up. It's Homer. How these four common bonds, be able to explain each of them in class, because they are so very important to understanding Archaic Age Greece after this Dark Age. How do they act as a binding force against the natural development of the city-state pseudo-geography? And the interconnectedness of the development of the Athenian polis and the structure of classes and the family. Be able to summarize those. Have a good sense of what Archaic Age Greeks look like. Thanks for listening. Listen to it again if you need to, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.